everyone, I'm coming to you live from my apartment in Pacific Heights. As you know, I'm in a season of being in the Silicon Valley Bay Area. This video will be quite different from some of the others that I've done, as this is more of a sit down versus a vlog, but I felt like the topic today is quite important and relatable and will reach the people that it needs to reach. One of my core beliefs is that people sharing things that are happening in their lives and the testimonies in their lives help to edify others and reflect the character of God, how God is working in people's lives, and hopefully that encourages those that need that encouragement. Today's topic is something that I consistently wrestle with, and hence the inspiration on some of my reflections on it being, how do you know if a detour is God's will or as a result of your own doing? It is quite heated, and this video is for you if you can relate to this question, if you feel like you've moved in a certain direction and you are a little bit disillusioned as to whether that direction is God's doing, and any kind of delays you believe you are experiencing in terms of a promise being realized, trying to understand if the delay is intentional and set by God versus a mistake you made or a decision that you made, or maybe even sometimes your own disobedience that you're recognizing. I do not have all the answers. These are just merely principles that I've reflected and prayed on and helped me in seasons when I feel I am unclear, and I hope that they can help you as well. So let's get into it. Okay. So why am I talking about this? I've been doing a review of the Bible, so reading it from front to back, including chapters that sometimes are skipped or haven't really read before in depth. So starting from Genesis all the way to Revelations. I'm still in the Old Testament, but I've just wrapped up almost all the chapters that cover the walk of the Israelites with God out of Egypt to the Promised Land. And where the genesis of framing this question started was thinking about how a journey that could have taken days took the Israelites 40 years, and that journey was filled with a lot of their own disobedience, but also just closeness and layers upon understanding of God. And I feel that this was relevant because I found myself in moments like this before in my life, where I feel like I hear God clearly, there's a promise that's set in terms of the direction I should go, and then I go into that direction, and then there's all this opposition, there is doubting if I heard correctly, there is feeling certain emotions that are not peace, there's anxiety, there's doubt, there's all these sort of things. And I think, we're going to get into it in terms of, if you're in such a season, what do you do about it? The first principle I'm going to talk about is reflecting on whether that situation, that experience, that season is producing fruit in you. What do I mean by this? The first caveat is, I do not believe that God promises happiness. Nowhere in the Bible is God promising that He's going to make us happy, because happiness is a very temporary emotion that in most instances is linked to worldly pleasures. What God promises is purpose. And what I mean by purpose is twofold. There is a much more general purpose for humanity, for us to be able to hear the good news and to be reconciled to God through the sacrifice that Jesus Christ has made in our lives. And the way we do that is through believing in Jesus Christ, acquiring new skin and new life, and through that walking in closeness with God. The second one is a more specific purpose in your life that has to do with your sanctification. So once you know who God is, once you know who Jesus Christ is and the sacrifice that He's made, how do you then be led by the Holy Spirit through different experiences to shape your own character and ultimately be sanctified? And in this journey of walking closely and walking obediently towards or with God, how do you then reflect who He is into the world And then it ultimately influences how you show up in the different spaces, how you act, how you speak, and the type of fruit that comes from you in displaying the talents and the gifts that He's given you to the spaces that you occupy. Places that are not for you are places that go against cultivating this fruit in you. So if there are spaces that challenge or diminish your values and your ability to be able to stick up for your values, so if you believe that lying is wrong, if you believe that family matters, if you believe that equality and justice matter, and if spaces consistently compromise some of those core values to who you are, that is a warning flag. If there are spaces that diminish the talents and the gifts that God has given you, and you feel that you need to dumb them down or dumb yourself down in order to survive in that space, that is a warning flag. So that's the first discernment principle. The second one is, does this reflect what God has previously revealed? And again, there are two layers of revelation that I believe in. The first is just His word and the general revelation through His word, where He reveals who He is, where He reveals the principles of how He's always collaborated with humanity from the beginning of time, and how He prophesies that He'll do that until the end of time. And there is a consistency of God that we see in the word, and He never changes. So anything that is anti that is a lie by the devil, intended to deceive us. So therefore, the goal is to consistently understand who He is, don't be tempted by the things of this world, and consistently anchor your understanding of who He is on the right understanding. And you can only do that through maintaining specific spiritual rhythms that allow you to consistently fill up your knowledge and well of who God is, and anchor on the right identity of who God is, and then use that as your weapon against the world. So fasting becomes important, praying becomes important, meditating on the word becomes important, being part of a Christian community so that you can consistently sharpen each other becomes important, etc. But there's also specific revelations that are unique to you and your journey, and the things that God reveals around the promises that He has set for your life. You know best how God has consistently communicated to you, so I'm not going to be here to try to tell you that, but the seasons in your life should match up, because God is a consistent God. So if you find yourself in a season where it is completely just not matching up, and maybe you took a job because you were scared, maybe you ended up in a relationship because you just felt alone and you wanted, anyone to love you, and there were all these different flags but you ignored them, whatever it might be, if it does not resonate with something that God says in His word or has told you before that should match up with His word, then that's a red flag, or that's a warning sign. Then the last one I'll speak about is there holy peace or anxious strife? And this one is kind of linked to the first one in the sense that God does not promise happiness. So what I am not talking about is, are you feeling happy? Because most times, especially the deeper you go in your Christian walk, especially the more you grow older, you learn that happiness is not the goal. But what is the goal is peace. And peace comes in different forms, but one of the ways that you know that you have peace is that you are walking in step with the Holy Spirit. There isn't a silencing of the Holy Spirit in your life. You hear that quiet, subtle nudge when you wake up in the mornings, when you go to bed, that tells you that this might be hard, but God is here. This might be hard, but you are in His presence. That is peace. Just the feeling of being in God's presence and the ability to pull yourself into His presence consistently. The opposite of that is anxious striving. And what that is when you replace the pursuit of God and His will and just having faith that He has things sorted out with you trying to come up with a plan A, plan B, plan C. Instead of praying at night, you are Googling and trying to like figure everything out. You are then making decisions based on you trying to optimize the things in your life versus surrendering and saying, God, whatever happens, you are with me, and that's all that matters. It's a sign that you're living in anxious strive when you're trying to just design your own life the way you want it to be and have control and struggle with surrendering. So yeah, and maybe a practical example to bring everything to light is when I started my career in consulting, as I've said before, and when I was leaving, there was this opportunity that I felt was aligned. It was very entrepreneurial, focused, and I felt like that was the promise that God had made in my life. But at that same time, I was so keen to get away from consulting that I just saw this opportunity and I jumped at it, and in retrospect did not spend enough time praying to say, is this the right next step, etc. So instead of running towards something, I was running away from something, if I could summarize it in that way. And when I started the job, and everything went well, like I saw the opportunity, I interviewed, and I was like on this honeymoon phase to be like, God, I know that's you, I know that's you. Yes, they pay this, they do this, that justification that we do. And when I got to the job, it didn't take long for me to just see some of the red flags. And I ignored them all, consistently rationalizing that like, oh, but God once has told me that I'll be in something entrepreneurial, so this checks the box, let's go. But my values were compromised. There were certain things that were happening in that environment that consistently were trying to dim my light. And then when people around me, my parents were like, this is not a good space for you. You are increasingly anxious. You are not yourself. You are scared to speak up. Like, all these things are not you, right? And at some point, for me to get out of that space, like I went on a fast, and in that fast, it was just, being able to try to realign my life with God's. And the big insight was, okay, Hope, you made that decision out of anxiety, trying to leave consulting and trying to define what your next step is. Although I still followed what I thought was a promise, right? I think there was a lot of anxiousness and not stillness that informed taking that next decision. And I ended up in a place that I knew was just misaligned. Like, yes, there was this anxiousness to get to this entrepreneurial space, but the way I went about it was on my terms and not on God's terms. And it caused a lot of just anxiety. But at the end, what I want to say is that regardless of whether you are the one who caused this extra step and delay and maybe leaving the path that God had planned out for you, or whether it is God, and at the end of it, there's always going to be like we won't know until in hindsight, right? God redeems everything. If you look at Job, if you look at the Israelites, if you look at the prodigal son, all these stories and almost everyone in the Bible, there's always a redemption that God brings, and there's always using every single situation for his glory. So I just want to encourage you that regardless of whether you sit on whichever side of this question, it's never too late to remember that God will always embrace you back. Nothing that you do will ever change the will for your life. It might delay certain steps, it might take you in a different direction, but you're never too far out from God's will and from God's glory, or using your situation for his glory. With this job, I stayed only for 6 months, but this job and the things that I did were actually quite profound in helping me interview for the next role. And that's the role where I grew the most, where I ascended in the venture capital space, and my consulting experience ended up not being relevant. It was actually the things that I did on ground with these entrepreneurs in South Africa that I used in my interview that built confidence for me to be able to land the next role. And you guys know how my career went, and ultimately I landed where I am. So I just wanted to encourage, I guess, with the short video, Number one, if you're feeling you're in a specific season where you're having a lot of questions, it's helpful to just go through some of these principles just to be able to identify. If you do come to the conclusion that maybe you made decisions based on the wrong parameters, just a reminder that it's never ever too late for God to use and redeem that situation for His glory. But it takes you recognizing, repenting, going back to a space of alignment with God through prayer, through fasting, through reading His word, through worship, and then ultimately aligning your decisions with His will. So hope you guys enjoyed this short word. Happy, have a good week, and yeah, bye.